Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Today we're diving into a fascinating study that asks, could the way you imagine something change how fast you do it, but not whether you get it right? This paper explores how imagining yourself doing a task versus imagining an object doing the task affects our performance. It is a deep dive into the mind and how we simulate actions. Think about it when you imagine folding a paper into a crane or imagining your own body doing a dance move. Are these mental images the same or different depending on whether you see yourself doing it or just see the action happening? The researchers wanted to find out. So here is the big idea. Mental imagery, the ability to imagine things in your mind, is super important for how we learn and do things. They say it can be thought of as imagining yourself performing an action, or just imagining the action happening visually, like watching a movie. But how much does this agency or who is doing the imagined action really matter? Does imagining it as yourself versus as something else change how well you do it, or just how quickly? To figure this out, scientists looked at two cool mental tasks. One is called mental paper folding. Imagine you have a piece of paper and you have to mentally fold it a certain number of times and then guess if two edges will meet. The other task is mental body rotation. This is where you see a drawing of a body, maybe with an arm raised, and you have to figure out if it is a left or right arm or leg and if it is facing you or away. They got 142 people to do these tasks. What is neat is that each person did both tasks two ways. One way, they were told to imagine themselves doing it, feeling the movement in their body. This is called self-imagery. The other way, they were told to imagine the object doing the task, like a magical hand folding the paper or a figure just moving on its own. This is object-imagery. They carefully tracked how many mistakes people made and how long it took them to answer. They also asked participants to rate their experience after each task to see if the instructions really changed how they felt they were imagining things. They also measured other cognitive skills like intelligence and working memory to see how they related to the imagery task. To make sure everything was clear, they had a really structured process. Participants did the tasks in a specific order and the instructions were counterbalanced, meaning half the people did self-imagery first. Then object imagery and the other half did the opposite. This helps them spot any practice effects or carryover effects. In the paper folding task, participants had to imagine folding a flat pattern into a 3D shape. They were asked if two specific edges would meet. Self-imagery meant imagining folding it with their own hands, feeling the paper bend. Object imagery meant imagining the paper folding by itself like a magic trick. For the body rotation task, participants saw a figure and had to identify a body part. Self-imagery involved imagining their own body transforming into that position. Object imagery involved imagining the pictured figure doing the movement. After each task, they asked people questions like, did you feel your hands moving? Did you see the paper folding itself? This was to make sure the instructions really made people feel different kinds of imagery. Now, for the exciting part, what did they find? First, the manipulation checks worked. People reported feeling their bodies more with self-imagery and seeing the action more with object imagery. So the instructions did change their subjective experience of imagining. In mental paper folding, it took longer to answer when they imagined themselves doing it compared to imagining an invisible hand doing it. But this was a bit tricky. It depended on the order they did things. If they did self-imagery first, then switched to object imagery, they got faster at object imagery. If they did object imagery first, then switched to self imagery, they didn't get as big an advantage in self-imagery. This suggests that the feeling of self might stick around even when you're told to imagine it differently. Critically though, the number of errors was pretty much the same no matter how they imagined it. Now, in the mental body rotations task, it was different. People were slower when they imagined themselves doing it compared to when they imagined the picture doing it. And again, the errors were about the same for both ways of imagining. They also looked at how these tasks related to each other and to other cognitive skills. They found that performance on mental paper folding was more similar when people used the same type of imagery for both tasks. Same for mental body rotations. This implies that self-imagery uses one set of mental tools, and object imagery uses a slightly different set. Interestingly, their brain skills like general intelligence or how well their working memory worked didn't really predict how well they did on these imagery tasks. It seems imagery ability might be its own thing and not just a reflection of general smarts. So what does all this mean? The main takeaway is that how you imagine a task can change how fast you do it, but it doesn't really change how accurate you are. This is a big finding because it suggests that the brain uses different systems for the speed of a mental task and the correctness of it. The self-imagery instructions really made people feel like they were doing it themselves with their bodies. The object imagery made them focus more on the visual outcome of the action without a person involved. Both felt equally clear though, which means vividness isn't the whole story. The paper folding task got harder with more folds, just like you'd expect. And the body rotation task was harder with feet and front views, which makes sense because it is more awkward to imagine. That carryover effect in paper folding was really interesting. It suggests that when you've imagined yourself doing something, that self-feeling can linger and affect how you perform later, even if you are told to imagine it differently. This wasn't as strong in the body rotation task. They think this is because body images automatically tap into our own body knowledge, whereas paper folding is more abstract and needs more of a push to engage self-imagery. The research strongly supports the idea that different ways of imagining engage different brain processes. Imagining yourself using your body taps into those motor areas. Imagining an object or just the visual outcome relies more on visual processing. It is not just one giant imagination system, but different modes that can be flexed. And that disconnect between how vivid someone feels their imagery is and how well they actually perform is super important. It tells us that just because you feel like you are imagining something clearly doesn't mean you'll be faster or more accurate. Objective performance measures tell a different story. They also noted that mental paper folding seemed to relate more to general spatial intelligence and working memory, whereas mental body rotations were more about our own sense of self and body. This further separates the tasks into object-based versus body-based processing. Now for the limitations. The study mentions that because they collected data remotely and to avoid fatigue, they didn't have a huge number of trials for each person. This is a common trade-off in online studies. Also, they didn't have a washout period between the different imagery instructions. This means it is possible that the instructions weren't completely separate, and there might have been some lingering effects from the previous instruction. So what's the big? So what here? This research tells us that how we shape our mental imagery by telling our brain to see ourselves or just see the action can actually change our processing speed, but not necessarily our accuracy. It highlights that our imagination isn't a single entity. It can be tuned to be more embodied, focusing on our own body's feelings, or more visual, focusing on the outcome. This has cool implications for how we train for sports or learn new motor skills. If a task benefits from imagining yourself doing it, then that is the way to go. If it is more about visualizing the outcome, then maybe that's better. This research really paints a picture of a flexible imagination system that can adapt to task demands and how we instruct it. It's not a rigid system, but a dynamic one. It's about understanding that our imagination can be our fastest tool or our most detailed one. What do you think about these findings? Have you ever noticed that when you imagine yourself doing something versus just watching it happen, it feels different? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science insights, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the mind. Thanks for watching.